He is one of the most popular and enduring icons of the American West, the gentleman bandit who charmed his way through life, always keeping one step ahead of the law. With his fabled wild bunch, he terrorized the banks and the railway companies during the closing decade of the 19th century. Then he headed south of the border, only to meet his match at the hands of Bolivian troops. In this week's Biographics, we delve into the life and the death of Butch Cassidy. Robert Leroy Parker was born in Beaver, Utah on April 3rd, 1866. He was named after his grandfather, who helped lead a group of Mormon handcart refugees thousands of miles across the country to the utopia that was Utah. Traveling along the Mormon Trail, they pulled all of their belongings in handcarts. With their faith in Brigham Young and the Lord, they headed into the snowdrifts of the Continental Divide. Robert Parker Sr. was a strong man, but the harsh winter, it was too much for him, and he was found dead one morning, frozen in his blanket. The party forged on, and after many trials, they made it to Utah. Parker's widow and 12-year-old son Max settled at American Fork, some 30 miles south of Salt Lake City. In 1865, they moved to Beaver, where Max married Ann Campbell. The couple would go on to have 13 children together. Robert, known as Bob, he was the oldest. Max Parker became a successful businessman. When Bob was a young child, his father purchased a ranch 12 miles south of Circleville and moved the family there. He employed a number of cowboys, including a petty criminal by the name of Mike Cassidy. Cassidy took a shine to young Bob, who appeared to idolize the swaggering outlaw. He taught the boy how to shoot a gun, ride a horse, rope, and brand and rustle cattle. Bob was a good study, and by the time he was 16, he had developed a reputation as a fine shot and a competent horseman. He developed into a solid, strapping teenager with a pleasant and jovial personality. There is not a lot known about Butch's later teen years. It appears that he took work as a rancher in various locations until 1884. At one point, he gained work as a butcher in Rock Springs, Wyoming. It was at this time that he took the nickname Butch. The surname Cassidy was an homage to his childhood hero, Mike Cassidy. Cassidy's first run-in with the law occurred around 1880. He wanted to buy some food and some clothes, but found the shop to be closed. Undeterred, he simply broke in and took a pair of jeans as well as a pie. However, he also left an IOU note indicating that he would return to settle his account later. The shopkeeper, though, he was not impressed, and he had Butch arrested. The case ended up before the courts, where a jury acquitted him. In 1889, a 23-year-old Butch Cassidy turned up in Telluride, Colorado. Located in the San Juan Mountains, Telluride was a wild mining town full of gold-hungry prospectors. The place was filled with saloons, gambling houses, and brothels. Sitting right smack in the middle of town was the San Miguel Valley Bank. Cassidy teamed up with a fellow drifter by the name of Matt Warner, and the two were joint investors in a racehorse named Betty. The money for that investment came through cattle rustling. They then decided to set their sights a little higher, determining to rob the local bank. It is believed that they robbed a stage in Denver prior to the bank heist. They then made a show of spending money liberally around Telluride in order to show that they were not desperate men. On the morning of June 24th, 1889, Cassidy, Warner, and two accomplices, one who is believed to have been Harry Longabob, better known as the Sundance Kid, hitched their horses outside of the livery store in Telluride and then headed for a saloon not far from the San Miguel Valley Bank. Just prior to noon, they noticed one of the tellers exit the bank, leaving just one man on duty. Two of the outlaws kept guard outside while the other two entered the bank. Amazingly, none of the robbers bothered to wear a mask or otherwise conceal his identity. History also does not reveal the role that each individual played. We do know, though, that one of the men who went into the bank approached the lone teller and told him that he wanted to cash a check. When the man began to inspect the check, his head was grabbed and shoved into the desk. At this point, the two outside came in and all four began ransacking the bank in search of money. They got away with more than $20,000. On the way out of town, Cassidy and Warner were recognized by two men. Still, they managed to get away, hiding out in a remote area of southeastern Utah known as Robber's Roost. This would become a favorite place of escape for Cassidy and his gang, who built cabins there and kept their stolen cattle, horses, and weaponry in this area. Cassidy used some of the profits from that bank job to buy a ranch near Du Bois, Wyoming. In 1894, he began a relationship with a teenage girl by the name of Ann Bassett, who was the daughter of a wealthy cattle rancher. For 4 years after the San Miguel Valley bank robbery, Butch managed to live the life of a law-abiding citizen. However, shortly after becoming involved with Ann, he was arrested for horse stealing. His trial took place in Lander, Wyoming, and resulted in his conviction and sentence to 2 years imprisonment at the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Laramie. Cassidy proved to be a model prisoner. He applied to the Wyoming governor for an early release. This was agreed on the condition that he would stay out of trouble in the future. Butch, he agreed, but he had no intention of following through on that promise. Immediately upon his release on January the 19th, 1896, he rejoined his gang at an area of their Robber's Roost hideaway known as the Hole in the Wall. It was following Butch's release from the Wyoming State Penitentiary that he and his Wild Bunch gang began their crime spree in earnest. The gang was enlarged to more than 30 members, with a core of such notables as the Sundance Kid, Kid Curry, and Elza Lay. On the mid-afternoon of August 13, 1896, 3 men rode into Montpelier, Idaho. They dismounted in front of the bank, and then 2 of them pulled their bandanas over their faces. The bandits quickly pulled out their revolvers, and the 2 wearing bandanas herded the men into the bank. Inside were a number of customers and bank employees. Everyone, except for one of the cashiers, was ordered to line up against the wall. One of the robbers, who is believed to have been Cassidy, kept his gun trained on the terrified customers, while another filled bags with cash, gold, and silver. Before leaving with their $7,000 booty, Cassidy ordered the people to wait for 10 minutes before raising the alarm. The robber who had remained outside, Bob Meeks, was the only one who did not cover his face. He was recognized by a town resident and ended up being one of only 3 people who was captured and convicted of the crime. Cassidy was well known in Utah and, as a result, had a general rule of not committing crimes in that state. However, in April of 1897, he made an exception to that rule. His target was the payroll of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company in Cast Gate. This was the largest coal mine in Carbon County, Utah. Furthermore, it was ideally located between the gang's favorite hideouts of Robber's Roost and Brown's Hole. The company knew that their payroll was an enticing prize for bandits, and so they tried to prevent heists by keeping irregular paydays. The payroll came in on a train that was heavily guarded. Butch decided that going up against the train was too risky, and so he determined to take the money directly from the paymaster. In order to do so, however, the gang would need to know when the payroll was going to arrive. On April the 17th, Cassidy rode into the town of Castle Gate and went to one of the saloons, where he inquired if there was any work going for a ranch hand. He was told that there might be, if he was patient enough. With his excuse for hanging around now established, he made his way to the train depot. He watched the goings-on as the train came and went, and then returned to the saloon. For the next week, he repeated this process, observing every train that came into town. On April the 22nd, Cassidy's patience was finally rewarded. A whistle from the mine announced that it was payday. When the train arrived, Butch watched from a distance as the paymaster, F.I. Carpenter, and a couple of aides carried money bags from the train to his office. The bags were heavy, containing more than $7,000 in gold and over $100 in silver, so the men were going slowly. Then, just as they were ready to climb the stairs to the paymaster's office, Carpenter was approached from behind and a revolver was poked into his ribs. Butch informed him that he was about to relieve him and his pals of their load, adding that he'd hate to have to shoot any of them. Carpenter was stunned that such a brazen attack would be attempted in broad daylight. There were plenty of miners around, but very few of them spoke English or would have been aware of what was going on. Gang member Elza Lay emerged from the shadows and helped Butch take possession of the money bags. Carpenter and his helpers left them to it, seeking protection in the nearby hardware store. The paymaster then began yelling out that he'd been robbed. Cassidy and Lay attempted to mount their horses while stowing the money in their saddlebags. However, Butch's horse got spooked and took off, leaving him standing in the middle of the street with a bag of gold in his hand. Lay managed to track the horse down and bring it back to the 2, and they made away with over $7,000 in gold. They left the bag of silver just lying in the street. Paymaster Carpenter now sprang into action. He ran for the telegraph office and instructed the clerk to send an urgent message to the authorities in Price, which was some 10 miles away. However, the clerk told him that the lines had been cut. Thinking fast, he made for the train and told the driver to hightail it to Price. As the train chugged along, it went right past the fleeing robbers. It took several hours before the sheriff at Price could get a posse organized. In addition to having this head start, Butch was also very familiar with the countryside and was easily able to evade his pursuers. Local ranchers were also happy to provide his gang with fresh horses, having no loyalty to the big mining companies, or indeed the banks. Cassidy and Lay, they made it back to their base at Robber's Roost, where they lay low with the other gang members. The officials in Utah were well aware of where the robbers were, but showed no enthusiasm for going after them. As a result, the local papers began to accuse the lawmen of cowardice. For 3 months, Butch and his men spent their time drinking, gambling, and horse riding. Then, when the boredom was too much, they decided to go out and start spending their takings. They ranged around buying fine clothes, getting haircuts, and spending up large in the saloons and the brothels. By the end of June 1897, it was time to get back to the business of robbery. The gang set their sights on the town of Belle Fourche, north of Black Hills. On June the 28th, Butch sent gang member Tom O'Day to scout out the town. The plan was to rob the bank once O'Day had got him back. However, O'Day managed to get himself drunk and didn't return to camp until it was far too late. An angry Butch had to delay the heist for 24 hours. The next day, Butch selected the Sundance Kid along with George Curry, Walt Putney, and Tom O'Day to do the job at the Butte County Bank. The three men followed the usual procedure, drawing their revolvers and forcing the customers to stand along the wall with their hands in the air. However, passerbys saw this through the window and they raised the alarm. Chaos erupted on the street as people rushed to get off the street while others went for their guns. The bandits inside, they quickly realized that they'd been found out. They rushed out, firing their guns in the air and attempting to get away. A couple of townspeople returned fire from behind cover. Kid Curry was unable to get to his horse, so tried to mount a mule only to discover that it wouldn't move. As the other two rode out of town, Tom O'Day attempted to steal away into a side street but was caught and held overnight in the local bank vault before being transported to the jail in Deadwood the very next day. The robbery had been an unmitigated disaster. It had cost the gang a valued member and earned them just $97, leaving behind $3,000. In the early morning hours of June 2nd, 1899, the Wild Bunch pulled off one of their most celebrated crimes. Two members of the gang with red lanterns flagged down the Union Pacific Overland Flyer train just outside of the Wilcox Station in Wilcox, Wyoming. The driver thought the two men were warning him that the driving rain had washed out an approaching bridge. He threw on the brake to bring the train to a screeching halt. But when he saw that the men had guns drawn, he realized the truth and began running down the track to warn a coming train to back off. The bandits let him go and jumped onto the train, where they ordered the engineer to pull the train into a nearby trestle on the far side of the bridge. Once the train had crossed over, one of the bandits lit the fuse to a stash of dynamite which had been placed on the bridge. The bridge was damaged enough that the second train would be unable to follow. The train engineer then ordered the train forward another 2 miles, where the rest of the gang were waiting. The robbers then made their way to the express car, only to find out that the guard, he wasn't going to open the door. So they decided to blow it open with dynamite. This rattled the guard to the extent that he couldn't remember the combination to the safe. So, well, the robbers blew that open as well. The result was that all the cash went flying everywhere. Still, the gang managed to get away with more than $50,000 worth of cash, gold, and jewelry. The robbery made national headlines and brought the Wild Bunch to the attention of the nation's premier crime fighters, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. For the next 2 years, the Pinkertons doggedly tracked down the gang. Meanwhile, a posse was formed to chase down the train robbers. They caught up with the 3 bandits on June the 6th at Castle Creek. A gun battle ensued in which Kid Curry shot and killed the sheriff leading the posse. The other posse members then withdrew as the outlaws escaped. Butch Cassidy was not of the rough and tumble mold most of his contemporary outlaws were. He was an extremely sociable man who was a great conversationalist. When not engaged in criminal activity, he impressed others with his strong work ethic. By 1899, he had a thriving ranch in Du Bois, Wyoming, and was growing tired of the outlaw life. In the summer of that year, he visited the office of attorney Orlando Powers in Ogden, Utah. He explained to the attorney that he had been portrayed as a vicious criminal when in fact he had never hurt anybody and had only ever robbed from large corporations. Bush then urged Powers to approach the governor on his behalf, seeking an amnesty deal. The lawyer responded that a deal was extremely unlikely and the best thing that Bush could do was to go back into hiding. Undeterred, Bush sought out another attorney. This time, a meeting was arranged with Utah Governor Herbert Wells. Wells was impressed by Cassidy and told him that as long as there were no outstanding murder warrants for him, he was sure that amnesty could be arranged. A second meeting was arranged, which Bush attended in full confidence. He was surprised to learn, however, that the governor's office had uncovered an outstanding murder warrant in his name. Bush protested that he'd never killed a man in his life. He didn't have had to, though, the governor responded. The mere charge was enough. It meant that amnesty was simply out of the question. With the failure of his attempt to go straight, it seems that Butch carried out a string of further robberies around the turn of the century. He and the Sundance Kid have been linked to a train robbery in Tipton, Wyoming in August of 1900 and the Winnemucca, Nevada bank heist a month later, though there is no concrete evidence that they took part. With no prospects to end his fugitive life in the West, Butch began making plans to head south of the border. When he proposed the idea to his gang members, only two were interested: the Sundance Kid and Kid Curry. Before the gang split up for good, its 5 core members had a final rendezvous in Texas. After having their fill of liquor, fine dining, and women, they sat for a group photograph in new suits. The photo that was taken on that day made its way to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and it was used on wanted posters. Butch and Sundance then split up, promising to meet up again in New York City. This they did, with Sundance being accompanied by his longtime girlfriend at a place. The trio boarded the ship Hermanas, bound for Buenos Aires on February the 20th, 1901. Immediately upon arrival, Butch, using the assumed name of Jim Ryan, deposited $12,000 in a local bank as the first step in putting up a land claim. They ended up purchasing 17,000 acres of land in Cholilo. To their neighbors, they appeared to be hard-working gringos, except for one disturbing fact: wherever they went, they wore their guns. Butch and Sundance had presumed that a move out of the country would bring an end to their pursuit by the Pinkertons, but they were mistaken. Robert Pinkerton, the head of the agency, sent a letter to the Buenos Aires police chief with descriptions and photos of the duo. The local police identified them as the two ranchers who always wore guns around Cholilo. They attempted to keep a close surveillance on the men until the Pinkertons arrived and apprehended them. The two outlaws would spend 7 years in Argentina before the law finally caught up with them. For the first 5 years, they kept their noses clean, blending in with the locals and becoming popular members of the Cholilo community. Then, for some reason, they returned to a life of crime in the spring of 1906. They teamed up with another American fugitive and robbed the bank in Mercedes, getting away with $20,000. However, one of the 3 robbers shot and killed a bank teller. Once again, Butch and Sundance were on the run. On November the 6th, the outlaws made their way to San Vicente, Bolivia. They were put up in the spare room of a local villager. However, a local official identified them and notified members of the Bolivian cavalry. The room where Butch and Sundance were holed up was surrounded. There are a number of versions as to how the last moments played out. The most accepted version is that Sundance sprinted out onto the patio in a desperate attempt to get some rifles. These were located by an outside wall, and he was firing his revolvers into the air as a distraction as he ran. However, he was cut down before he made it off the patio. Butch ran out after him and dragged his mortally wounded friend back inside, sustaining at least 1 wound in the process. After pouring masses of lead into the building and hearing only silence from within, the Bolivian troops finally made their way inside. They found the bodies of the 2 outlaws lying on the floor. Sundance had been shot several times in the arms and once in the forehead, while Butch had a bullet hole in the temple. The soldiers inferred that Butch had put his best friend out of his misery before turning the gun on himself. However, there was never an inquest, and the 2 men were never formally identified. The most wanted men in America were simply buried in unmarked graves. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. If you're looking for something else to watch right now, do check out our other videos linked to on the screen. And as always, thank you for watching.